I've spoken to over a dozen people, probably 15 plus people, who operate, either have operated or are operating inside what we would call the legacy retrieval of non-human craft, and reverse engineering program. I think one of the most galling, shocking moments for me was when people that I was talking to in the program, who are still in the program, admitted to me that we're using high-pulse microwave weapons, HPMs, to
take them down.
Craft.
Have we purposely murdered other beings?
Oh, God, that's a horrible thought, isn't it?
Have we?
I suspect we have. I've asked them what happened to the beings, and I just get a squeamish look.
For decades, the public has been fed a comfortable lie that the UFO phenomenon is just distant lights in the sky, weather balloons, or swamp gas. But behind closed doors, elite military operators, intelligence analysts, and officials with flawless, lifelong reputations have been trying to tell us the terrifying truth. We aren't just being observed, we have made contact. When men of impeccable standing, decorated pilots, nuclear launch officers, and high-ranking intelligence briefers risked their careers, their pensions, and their literal freedom to step forward, man, you have to listen. They are pulling back the curtain on a hidden reality that most people have no idea exists. A reality where physical, biological interactions with non-human intelligence are actively managed, covered up, and contained by deep black operations. Today we are looking at the rock-solid testimony of the insiders who were actually there. When the barrier broke, men like Major George Filer, an Air Force intelligence officer whose daily job was briefing the highest-ranking generals in the military. He didn't read about this on a forum. He walked into his command post to find his base in a panic because a non-human entity had just been shot and killed on an American runway. And that's the story that we're digging into today. This isn't a story about reverse engineering sci-fi technology. It's about raw, volatile, physical interactions from the military runways of New Jersey to a chaotic, fatal capture in Varginha, Brazil. We are uncovering the uniform protocol the global military structure uses when humans and aliens collide. So, get ready, because we are touching the third rail of disclosure and exploring the dark reality of physical contact that they never wanted you to discover.
In 1978, on January 18th, I was going into the base. Every morning I did the briefing to the general staff, and I noticed that there are some lights off in the distance at the end of the runway there. And when I got into the command post, the senior master sergeant in charge said that there had been UFOs in the pattern all night. They're on radar. The tower had seen them. They got in aircraft reports and so on. And that one had landed or crashed at Fort Dix. Fort Dix and McGuire are right together. And this is kind of like the Roswell of the East. But in any case, an alien had come off the craft and had been shot by a military policeman, and apparently was wounded and was heading for McGuire. So for whatever reason, the aliens liked the Air Force better than the Army, perhaps because they're shooting at them. But in any case, our security police went out there and found him on the end of the runway dead. And they asked me to brief the general staff, General Tom Sadler, and at the 8 o'clock stand-up briefing. And I said, I don't think I want to do this. You know, the general doesn't have a good sense of humor, and I'm not sure I believe this. So I did some checking, called the 438th Command Post, and everybody had pretty much the same story. And at 8 o'clock that morning, just before I went on, was going to brief this, and I was very worried about it. They said, don't brief it, that it's too hot, so to speak. That's pretty much my story, and I'm prepared to tell the story in front of Congress, and it is the truth. Now, because of this, I've stayed interested in UFOs, and I'm the Eastern Director of the Mutual UFO Network. And between the National Reporting Center and Peter Davenport and the MUFON, we get 100 reports a week on average of people from all over the United States that see these things regularly. And if you start checking, they're out there and they're low, and people are seeing them all the time. And these are highly qualified people, all of whom essentially give us the reports by email. Thank you.
So I got to give you a detailed account of what actually happened at Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base. So let's set the stage, right? It's 1978. Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base complex is buzzing. Radars have been tracking low-flying anomalous targets, displaying impossible flight characteristics all night. The public is actually reporting seeing objects and lights in the vicinity of the base for the days that were leading up to this event. Then chaos erupts on the ground. An Army MP patrolling dense woods of Fort Dix spots a low-hovering blue-green oval craft. And this was Sergeant Jeff Morris. In the glare of his headlights, a creature appears. We're not sure if the craft crashed or just landed, but the creature appears. It's small. He said about 4 feet tall, thin, had like gray-brown, dull skin. And you're going to want to remember this because it links to another crash. And it had an oversized head, right? So panic set in. The MP draws his .45 automatic, orders it to freeze, and then he opens fire. The wounded entity flees, scaling a high-security fence separating Fort Dix from McGuire Air Force Base before collapsing and dying right on a deserted runway. An Air Force security patrolman, known to history by the pseudonym of Sergeant Jeffrey Morris, is ordered to the scene, right? He arrives to find the crime scene already being hijacked, but he isn't alone in noticing the bizarre aftermath. So this is where Major George Filer comes in, a highly decorated Air Force intelligence officer. And Filer's job every morning at 4 a.m. was to brief the commanding generals on threat assessments. And when he walked into the command post that morning, the atmosphere was frozen. A pale senior master sergeant looked at him and said, "An alien has been shot at Fort Dix, and they found it on the end of our runway." Filer confirmed the frantic movements. A specialized, unacknowledged team flown in directly from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's Foreign Technology Division. Yeah, the one that Major General William Neal McCaslin oversaw. They arrived in a massive C-141 cargo plane. But it's what they did on that runway that blows this case wide open. To understand the terror of the Wright-Patterson cleanup crew in New Jersey, we have to jump forward to 1996 to the city of Varginha, Brazil, an event often called the Roswell of South America. And following a reported UFO crash, multiple strange entities were seen wandering the local area. The descriptions given by local civilians and military personnel are chillingly specific, and they perfectly mirror what was seen at Fort Dix. The color of the entity, right? It was a distinct, greasy, dark brown, oily skin texture. So it kind of matches the entity that was at Fort Dix. The structure, extremely thin frames, long arms, large heads, and these massive almond black eyes. But the connection between these two cases is the smell. In both cases, they experienced a powerful ammonia smell. In the Varginha case, the doctor at the hospital said for days they had to completely shut down a section of the hospital because they couldn't get the smell out. And that's crazy. It was a suffocating, overwhelming odor of ammonia and sulfur. In Varginha, a 23-year-old military policeman named Marco Eli Carrez spotted one of these creatures hiding. And without thinking, he jumps out, grabs the entity barehanded, throwing it in the back of his police vehicle. And that was a fatal mistake. Within days, Carrezza began feeling a massive drain on his energy. He had a minor scratch on his body, but it turned into a raging, untreatable infection. His immune system completely collapsed. Within weeks, he was dead. Doctors were baffled. His body had utterly lost the ability to fight off baseline bacteria. Touching this entity had triggered a lethal biological shutdown. Now, back at Fort Dix in 1978, when Sergeant Jeffrey Morse watched the mysterious Blue Beret forces, and these forces tend to pop up all the time. Like the Kecksburg incident, there was these guys in these blue uniforms from the Air Force, and they pop up everywhere. If you're familiar with UAP GERB, you're familiar with these Blue Berets. But if not, I'm going to give you a breakdown here, right? So the Blue Berets, they take over the runway. They didn't just pick up the body, though, right? They approached it with intense caution, completely spraying down the corpse of this alien with an unknown chemical substance. And this was eyewitnessed by this Sergeant Morse. They weren't cleaning it, they were decontaminating it. They knew exactly what this was back in 1978. But the soldiers in Brazil didn't know. So obviously there's some kind of biohazard when you're dealing with these entities, right? So they knew exactly what Wright-Patterson's biohazard division already understood. These entities carry an exotic, potentially lethal biological footprint. And this could be similar to the thing that Jeremy Corbell even spoke about, this these biologics that can symbiotically manipulate individuals. Now, that could be a different entity, that could be a different substance. I don't know, but it's an interesting data point, right? But how did they transport them? This is the crazy part. So in both cases, they loaded these bodies into these stainless steel boxes. You know, they weren't put in body bags. They were immediately sealed inside specialized heavy-duty airtight steel shipping containers to prevent any atmospheric leakage. So they were being super cautious with this, right? And the body from the Varginha, Brazil crash got shipped to the USA. And this was on James. Critics said these stories were nothing more than campfire tales passed around by ufologists, that there was nothing to them. But thanks to the work of people like Leonard Stringfield and people at NICAP, they really dug into this case, found the eyewitnesses, found the other witnesses, and really broke this wide open. And I'm really surprised it's not a bigger story. There's been a complete block of getting any kind of FOIA, but there is evidence from people making reports of seeing the craft near the bases, and the accounts of, Major George Filer and this Sergeant Morse, who Morse said he received harassment threats. He was even taken into custody for a trumped up charge in California, and he sued some authorities there. So this is just a real messy case, but we're not going to get into all that. We're going to stick to the facts of the crash retrieval, right? Stephen Greer organized this historic National Press Club disclosure event, which unfortunately it was overshadowed by 9/11, which happened a couple months later. But he presented over 20 high-ranking military intelligence, FAA, and government witnesses, and they stood before the global media, risking their pensions, reputations, and freedom to testify under oath. And they all said they were willing to testify before Congress. I feel like it took a lot of courage to do that, because some of them were definitely breaking NDAs. But who was standing there amongst these 20 high-level, impeccable witnesses? It was Major George Filer.
This particular morning, when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said that it's been a very exciting evening, that we've had UFOs in the, over the McGuire all night, and that one had apparently landed or possibly crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot them. And I said, a foreigner, an alien? I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. And he says, no, an alien from outer space. He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that it had run away after being wounded and headed for McGuire. Now, McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them. And this alien supposedly climbed the fence or went under it or whatever and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. And the security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. And he said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the plane. And that made me stand up because I didn't realize that Wright-Patterson had C-141s. I thought Military Airlift Command was the only one who owned C-141 aircraft. So I was like, my gosh, what's going on here? And he says, we want you to brief this at the, stand-up general briefing this morning. And
he goes on to say that he was supposed to brief the general about this, but at the last moment that was called off. And George Filer, was brought in to see some photos, presumably of the being that was shot. But then somebody stepped in and said, no, you can't see those. And this was very unusual because as the official briefer, he would have access to almost everything, but he was not allowed to see these photos of the being. However, he got really curious and he started asking around, and he did talk to someone who had seen the being. And here is what he has to say about that.
I talked to one of the security policemen who claims to have been out there. And he indicated that he essentially saw a small body that, could have been like a child, but it seemed to have a larger than normal head. Now, one interesting thing is many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection to this were quickly transferred from the wing commander on down, indicating that if you knew something, they tended to split you up, so to speak, so you couldn't talk about it.
It's kind of sad, man. There's a lot of cases like this. You hear about it with the psionic acid sets. They actually meditate, bring the craft in, and then they hit it with some type of scalar weapon to knock it down, and then they recover the technology to reverse engineer. And Philip Corso wrote a great book in 1997, and it was The Day After Roswell was the name of the book. And he said that all our technologies that we have today, the things that we use on our cell phones, fiber optics, Kevlar, everything, man, integrated circuit chips, was all because they contracted out and gave these private contractors these technologies to reverse engineer and release to humanity, to better humanity. And what Stephen Greer says at this 2001 Press Club event is basically that we have the technology now to get off of fossil fuels, to have clean energy. It would basically eradicate poverty and a lot of the problems that we suffer today in this economy that's based on scarcity. And we would stop harming the planet. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Is that possible that they've had this technology? And Don Phillips, from Skunkworks, the whistleblower, he was at that 2001 Press Club event. And, he's done interviews where he said, we have the technology. Ben Rich has said, we already have the technology to travel to the stars. Now, that's a paraphrase. That's basically what he said, that we have things in the desert that's 50 years ahead of anything you could possibly conceive. That's wild. And it makes you really look at our reality like, well, what the fuck is going on, man? It's just this whole rabbit hole is wild because it has all these different implications for consciousness, life, the impacts on religion, education, economics, politics, global relations, but they pose everything as a threat. They want to keep the public scared all the time. And I'm not quite sure why that is. Why would you want your people to be afraid all the time with these invented threats? It's this military industrial complex, and the key word in there is industrial, right? This is they're making money off of killing people, and it's a damn shame.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Clifford Stone. I was a Sergeant First Class, United States Army. I had a secret clearance with nuclear assurity. I could get the clearance that I needed to do whatever it was that was necessary for me to do at the time on special operations when I was called in on those. What I'm referring to here is that I was involved in situations where we actually did recoveries of crashed saucers, for lack of a better term, debris thereof. There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive. While we were doing all this, we were telling the American public there was nothing to it. We were telling the world there was nothing to it. I'd like to go into detail on some of the cases about the nuts and bolts cases right here, but I will be available if you have any questions concerning my involvement in this. You can talk to Dr. Greer to arrange for me to get to talk to you. But the whole situation is, we've set back, we've told the American people that there's no such thing as UFOs. I've been involved where we have recovered these objects. We know them to be of extraterrestrials. In 1969, I had an event that happened to me while I was stationed at Fort Lee, Virginia. We went to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. That would be my first exposure to any time that we would be recovering an unidentified flying object. When we went there, we already had people that was already in the facility. We were a backup team, which was supposed to be NBC because there was supposed to be some nuclear materials that was on board this craft. Later on, most people involved were to be told that there was nothing on board it. It was nothing more than just a crash of one of our aircraft. I know better because I was one of the people that approached it with a Geiger counter to get surface readings. I was the first person to go ahead and see that there were bodies on it. That would be the first of approximately 12 events. UFO crashes are not events that take place every day. They're rare. I know we're not alone in the universe. I know that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's evidence that has been denied to the American people.
Good morning. My name is Carol Rosen. In 1974, after being a sixth grade school teacher, I was introduced to the late Dr. Wernher von Braun in the U.S., the father of rocketry. In my first meeting with him, during that first 3.5 hours, he said to me, "Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space." And I said, teachers don't stop until June. He said, "No, you have to understand. This is February. And we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. There are many enemies," he said, "against whom we're going to build this space-based weapon system. The first of whom was the Russians, which was existing at that time. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids." And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat. Well, at the time, I kind of laughed when he said asteroids, and when he said extraterrestrials, I knew I wasn't going to deal with that subject. And now we hear on the news just today, this week, that they've slid in another enemy. Only this time we're going to protect our satellites. In other words, we have to have some reason to spend these trillions, to waste these dollars on a space-based weapon system, and they're all lies. This is a system, he told me, that would never protect anyone. Even back then, he talked about suitcase bombs. He talked about chemical, viral, bacterial, biological warfare, that these space-based weapons would never protect us against. And then he told me that, in fact, if you travel around the world, which I did after he died in 1977, I met with people in over 100 countries who were friends. They didn't want to build space-based weapons. I became a space and missile defense consultant, and I worked with people around the world. I became an advisor to the People's Republic of China. They don't want to build a space-based weapon system, and he told me back then that they didn't. He said, "Go to Russia. They're considered to be the enemy." I got on a plane by myself. When I got to Russia, I had a list of people that I had read out of the newspaper. Chernenko was in office then. He was the only one I didn't get a chance to meet. They introduced me to everyone when I got there. And when I got back, I said, "Oh my Lord, this man is telling the truth. There is no threat, And I've been waiting until this day for 27 years, and I'm expecting the spin to happen, because he also explained to me that as a military strategist, as a person who worked on the MX missile, which I did later, he said, you will find that there is going to be a spin to find some enemy against whom we have to build space-based weapons. And now we should expect the spin, because he said part of the formula for the intelligence community is if they might have a weapon, then we have to consider that they do have these weapons. So now they do have these weapons, so now we have to build these weapon systems. And that's the formula, except that it's all based on a lie. And we have witnesses here today that have shown you that these extraterrestrial beings, that these craft that have come here are now not UFOs, they're identified flying objects. And we know that they have beings in them. And we have witnesses here who have told you that they can shut down our missile silos. They can stop a rocket going into space that's a test. We have witnesses here who have worked in the classified departments, who have the courage to come forward here to support what Wernher von Braun told me back in 1974 to 77. And I will testify before the Congress that when I founded the Institute for Security and Cooperation in Outer Space, which I shut down a few years ago because I didn't believe we had a chance with this huge, integrated around the world complex weapon system, that we had any chance at all of transforming that war industry into a space industry that could provide benefits, like Dr. Greer has said, of global warming. We can end that situation of that problem. We can end the energy crisis. We can build now non-polluting technologies. Wernher von Braun used to tell me that we could have cars back then that drove around off the ground. He described this to me on beams so that we have no pollution on this planet. And we can solve the problems of the people that are urgent and potential, and the other animals and the other cultures on Earth and in space. And we can end the arms race without dislocating the industry jobs, without disrupting the economy, by transforming, Wernher von Braun told me, the war industry into a global cooperative space industry that will provide, he said, finally, more jobs and profits on this planet than during any hot or cold wartime, more products and services that can be applied directly to solving the problems of this planet. And we can have a whole planet now that lives in peace on Earth, with all the cultures on Earth and with all the extraterrestrial cultures in space. And these are words that Wernher von Braun told me in 1974. And I will testify before the Congress under oath about everything I have said and more. Thank you.
But Fowler didn't just talk about tracking UFOs at 32,000 feet during his piloting days. He brought the weight of his intelligence background to the public stage, corroborating that the military infrastructure handles these events with extreme compartmentalized precision. And when you look back at the sheer volume of the 2001 Press Club witnesses, a terrifying mosaic forms, because these aren't isolated incidents. The protocols are uniform. Whether it's an airspace intrusion over New Jersey or a crash retrieval in the heart of Brazil, the playbook remains identical, right? Total military denial, immediate deployment of unacknowledged retrieval units like Wright-Patterson's Foreign Technology Division. I wonder if these are the people that Jake Barber runs with. If you guys are familiar with the whistleblower Jake Barber, he was in the Air Force and he was on these teams, and he's come out and spoken about it. I believe he wrote a book about it. And the other thing is the ruthless intimidation of civilian and baseline military witnesses. You know, they took this Sergeant Morsi and 3 other individuals to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he said it felt like a court-martial. They interrogated them. They were like browbeating them. He said there was one that was being nice, there was one that was mean, and then there was another one that just stood silent. And they played this psychological game with him and swore him to secrecy and told him he better not break his oath. And then when he came out and he talked about this, like I said, they actually took him into custody in California, and there's actually a civil lawsuit about that case. So this is what they do to these whistleblowers. And Sergeant Morse is a pseudonym. He didn't want to come out with his real name because he knew of the repercussions. And it's still happening. So when we look at the raw evidence, from Sergeant Morse being abruptly shipped off to Okinawa after the Fort Dix shooting, to Major Fowler's suppressed morning briefings, to a tragic death of Officer Careza in Brazil, the grand illusion of peaceful Hollywood-style first contact vanishes. The data tells us that these interactions are raw, violent, and biologically hazardous. When non-human intelligence and humanity cross paths in the shadows, it doesn't end with a handshake. It ends with a .45 caliber automatic, chemical spray downs, and steel boxes buried deep within underground bases. The paperwork might be scrubbed, but the witnesses are real, and the pattern is undeniable. So, thanks for joining me. This is the Touching the Third Rail. You're watching UAP Truth 33. Man, keep searching for the truth. Hit that subscribe button. Please like, subscribe, share it to a friend, share it to 2 friends. Love you guys. See you tomorrow. Peace.